So, we're doing well. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AEI. I'm Robert Doar, the president, and I'm thrilled, just honored and happy to welcome Virginia Governor and true friend to AEI, Glenn Youngkin, for a very important conversation with our Education Policy Director, Rick Hess, reflecting on the governor's record in education policy. Governor Youngkin's time in office is an example of what constructive education leadership should look like. When he took office, schools were in crisis. During the pandemic, education was paralyzed, while in too many places, ideology had displaced basic curriculum. And he has spent the past 4 years rebuilding the fundamentals of high-quality in-person education, restoring accountability to parents, taking politics and other distractions out of the classroom, and making sure every student has the knowledge and skills they need to succeed as citizens and as professionals in a rapidly changing moment. And the proof is in the results. Virginia is a national leader in tackling COVID learning loss, and the governor has accomplished this despite 4 years of divided government in Virginia. At every step of the way, to succeed, the governor has had to attract bipartisan support. And there's an important lesson here for conservatives across the country and in the federal government. Conservative approaches can have widespread appeal when they are rooted in principles that unite Americans and advance credible, empirically based solutions. It's no surprise that by putting parents and children first and staying relentlessly focused on results, Governor Youngkin has won over Virginians across the spectrum. So I'm proud of the role AEI's education scholars have played in diagnosing those challenges and developing solutions. These are scholars who are led by Rick Hess, and it's especially gratifying that our research could be a resource for the governor and his team. Thank you for your leadership, Governor, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Robert. So, look, Governor, let's just dig into this. If you don't mind, first couple questions, I'd love to kind of frame your administration. Back in 21, when you were running for office, you took a bold stance that was denounced as bigoted and ridiculous. You said parents ought to have a say in their kids' education. And at the time, this was coded as a bit of right-wing ideological pandering. Can you talk a little bit about why you wound up digging in on that in 21 and how that's played out?
Yeah, well, first of all, Rick, thank you for not only having me here today, and Robert, thank you for the kind words, but I just want to thank all of our friends at AEI. You have been tremendous partners in our journey in trying to bring what I just believe is common sense back into the classroom. And so thank you. I also just want to point out that two members of our administration are here. Emily Ann Gullickson, who is our superintendent of public instruction. By the way, she's awesome. We stole her from Arizona, and so thank you for the move. And of course, our Secretary of Education, Amy Gadara. Thank you both so much for all that you do. And all that we are going to talk about today is a tremendous effort from a broad group of people. And so just one big thank you for all being part of the team. And I just want to take us on a little bit of a time travel journey back to 2021 and just remind us, because we can forget that it was truly an out-of-body experience because it was an out-of-the-classroom experience for all of our children. And it really began with the misguided premise that a 12-inch screen was a quality education. And the one thing that 12-inch screen allowed so many parents to do was, maybe for the first time in their child's education, get a front row seat into what was going on in the classroom. And they were appalled. They were appalled. Not only was there not a very basic respect of values that might, in fact, preempt the learning curriculum, values that families hold, but on top of that, there seemed to be this wedded belief that distance learning, that in-classroom participation wasn't fundamental to success. And in 2021, particularly in Loudoun County, Virginia, but across the Commonwealth, what I heard over and over and over again was parents matter. And they need to be back in charge of their children's lives. And when we began to unpick the various elements of parents' roles in their children's lives, it married very well with Virginia code, which says parents have a fundamental right to make decisions in their children's lives with regards to their education, their upbringing, and their care. And so this just became a real rallying cry for not just a campaign, because that was almost a side note, but for the reestablishment of parents' preeminent role in their kids' lives. That's where it starts. That's where we found that we had to make the biggest correction to a massive deviation from what we know is right, that strong families and successful education begin with the relationship between parents and their children.
You know, you just alluded, obviously, to the COVID closures and the Zoom in a room learning that we dropped on kids. One of the first fights that you wound up in when you became governor was you issued an executive order that said masking should be optional for students. And you, with support of a number of Virginia Senate Democrats, insisted that schools could no longer be engaging in sustained closures. Now, when we talk about this today, everybody says, of course, we should have never been closed. That's not how it was at the time. I remember you getting called an ideologue and an extremist for these things. What was it like to be in the middle of those fights, and why did we get this stuff so wrong?
Well, first and foremost, it was an incredibly challenged time to make decisions because the inputs were not trustworthy. And I mean that with great respect to the folks that were providing the inputs, because I'm sure they were trying as hard as they could, but they were wrong. And intuitively, we felt they were wrong. And so, just to once again get in this time capsule, in January and February of 2022,
which is almost 2 years into the pandemic.
Into the pandemic, I'm inaugurated. Virginia's 46th in the nation in getting kids back in the classroom. And in fact, there was another wave of one of the COVID derivatives, and cases were going through the roof. And yet, we knew that kids back in the classroom was such a priority. We also knew that giving parents the ability to make choices for their children about whether their child wore a mask or not, and the severe challenges in learning to read and communicate when you have a mask on relative to when you don't, were inhibiting children's capabilities. And yet, the experts were saying that it was all a disaster. And I deeply appreciated the great counsel that I had around me at the time. In fact, the medical advisory team that I had around me was just extraordinary. And we made the very, very clear statement that one, we were making sure kids are back in the classroom. Two, that we are going to allow parents to decide with consultation with their own medical practitioners whether their child should wear a mask or not. It's not up to a governor or an administration. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that parents were making a decision about whether their child was to receive a vaccine or not. Again, removing the requirement that to attend school you had to receive this vaccine for 5-year-olds. I mean, it was just beyond my belief that we were mandating this stuff when parents were going to be best equipped to make a specific decision for their child. There was a lot of pushback, but at the time we were resolute in our fundamental belief that this was right. And so I had great people with me, and we charged ahead. And in hindsight, it's easy to play the game and say those were simple decisions, but there were a lot of sleepless nights as we made these decisions.
Well, perhaps the through line of your administration has been an emphasis on transparency and accountability in school performance. One, why, you know, if you want to articulate, because right now this is contested ground, as you know, nationally.
Yeah.
Why is it so important in your mind that we emphasize transparency and accountability in K-12 and higher ed? And two, can you talk a little bit about how you've tackled those during your time in the governor's mansion?
Well, I sort of compare this to a pretty basic analogy, which is if you're driving a car and you have no idea where you're going, you don't know where you are, and the windshield is blocked, it's going to be a pretty perilous journey. And that's the analogy for what education seems to have really thrust upon our kids and our families. First of all, we're going to tell everybody their kids are doing really well, regardless of how they're doing. And in fact, even though they really can't read at a proficient level, we're going to pass them through. Second of all, we really don't know what great looks like, so we don't have to worry about having to compare ourselves to something. And then finally, getting from here to there, therefore, isn't a challenge, and even though we can't see, it's okay, because we don't know where we are, and we don't know where we're going. That is the state of education in 2021 and 2022, and I dare say in many places, still the state of education, which is this fundamental misperception that assessing the proficiency of our children and concluding that they are not capable of doing the work or have not mastered the topics is some denigrating comments that is going to remove their ability to ever be successful. And it's the exact opposite. Unless we know where our children are, we'll never be able to react to get them to where they need to be. And so at the top of our agenda was transparency. Where are we? And of course, what we learned in Virginia very quickly was being 46th in the nation and getting the schools back open. And of course, having spent the previous literally 2 administrations in reducing standards, literally clouding the message. So even pre-pandemic, telling parents your children are doing fine when they weren't, resulted in Virginia having the largest learning loss in the nation in 4th grade reading and math, and right near it in 8th grade reading and math. I'm going to say that again, Virginia, which has had the reputation of being one of, if not the best education environment in the nation for K through 12, had the largest learning loss in the nation. And the rationale for surprise, I was shocked by. Wait a minute, you lowered expectations so the students weren't prepared coming in, and then second of all, you sent them all home and completely negated their ability to get the building blocks in place. Well, of course we did. And so that was a big moment of honesty, and that honesty gap of national test scores compared to Virginia test scores is like a beacon of transparency. It's between a 35 and 40% gap in proficiency in what national tests were telling Virginia and what Virginia's tests were telling us. And if you go around and tell everybody that they're doing fine, and by the way, you tell the schools that they're doing fine, then no one changes anything. And the bottom line is we weren't fine. We were struggling. When you have 65% of your students who aren't proficient in reading or math in the 3rd grade, you know you've got a problem coming. If you in fact tell parents that your kids are doing well, parents don't engage often the way that we would want them to. And finally, if you tell 91% of the schools that they are fully accredited and their students are doing fine, when in fact it's probably 40% of them really need a lot of help, then you are not just failing the system, but you're failing all the kids. And that's where we found ourselves back in 2022.
As you know, yesterday, National Assessment of Educational Progress comes out with 12th grade results. Nationally, they're abysmal.
Yeah.
12th graders are reading at the same level they were in 2005, wiping out 20 years of progress. Almost half of our 12th graders are below basic in math.
Yeah.
How does Virginia look on these numbers, and what can you point to as progress made since 2022?
Yeah. If I can, I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey. And I'm going to preface everything with one of my most recurring expressions of frustration is that the education system not only didn't know where they were, didn't know where they were going, had a blacked out windshield, but they were trying to drive looking in the rearview mirror. And looking in the rearview mirror meant that they were using data, old data, to try to decide what was happening. And again, no one would ever run an organization looking at data from 2 years ago to see how they were doing. And that's exactly what we continue to do as a nation. And we have got to fix this. But our immediate efforts in 2022 to address what I just described as this recognition of not just dishonesty, but the lack of attention to fix it needed to be addressed immediately. And so first, we committed ourselves to deliver for Virginia's kids and their parents. That was one, be transparent. How are they doing and what does it really mean? Number two, to raise expectations of excellence. And we went through the complete process of overhauling standards in the Commonwealth of Virginia so that we would no longer be last in the country. And previous administrations had reduced standards from where Virginia was leading the nation to where Virginia was last. And I have to say, even the Washington Post at that time said, what is Virginia doing? At the end of the day, we had to reestablish what excellence looks like. The third thing we knew we had to do was tackle the degree of learning loss and the chronic absenteeism that had plagued so many families. When you tell families, don't worry, you don't have to go to school, you can just do it from home on a computer, guess what they do? They don't go to school anymore. And chronic absenteeism, I believe, became one of the most challenging obstacles to combating the learning loss. And we passed on a bipartisan basis. I went and sat down with leaders from the Democrat-led General Assembly, and I said, we need to fund $418 million. We need to have intense tutoring, particularly for our 3rd through 8th graders who were suffering the most. When I say intense tutoring, literally intense tutoring, 2 to 5 hours a week of intense tutoring. We had self-guided tutoring funding that we put in place, and we put together a statewide, literally, task force, almost a call on everyone to combat chronic absenteeism. And then finally, we knew we had to overhaul the whole accreditation system because it was broken. And to have schools being told that they're fine when we know they're not is not just dishonest for the parents, but it almost cements that lack of performance. And so we tackled all of this. And I guess one of my big learnings, which I was told you could never do, is you can do all of this in government. You just have to commit yourself to do it. There's no single bill, there's no single program, there's no one person that is going to solve these immensely complicated issues. But if you hit all elements and just tell everybody, yes, we can, but we're also not taking failure as a possible outcome, you can get an enormous amount done. And that's what we did. We did all of that. And what happened as a result, I believe, was reflected in our most recent standard of learning tests in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is we made the tests harder and the students did better. How about that for a basic concept? We make the test harder and the students do better. I think we have to expect a lot out of our kids. And then we have to recognize that when we take the ceiling off and we provide students all kinds of multiple pathways to chase their dreams, and on top of that, we recognize that we need to lift the floor by providing all of the support mechanisms in order to lift the floor, you can do both. And all kinds of progress can be made.
You know, you just mentioned multiple pathways. Let's go there. Virginia has historically had what's widely recognized as a pretty toothless charter law. Hasn't had much in the way of school choice.
You can remove pretty. It's just toothless.
You know, you've pushed on this. One, I'd love to have you talk a bit about these lab schools that you were instrumental in creating. And two, about why it is that you're such a strong proponent for choice and what it is that makes it, that's made it so difficult to move in Virginia.
Yeah. So let me lay a little foundation. Our Constitution makes charter schools really hard because it requires both a state authorization and a local authorization. Now let me just ask everybody a question. If you run into the local school board and you say, hey, we want to create this school that's independent of your oversight, that actually does things differently than you want to do, it's pretty predictable how they're going to react. And as a result, at any time over the last 3 or 4 years, we've had a whopping 7 or 8 charter schools in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We just couldn't get them done. But we also recognize the fact that one size fits all is a completely failed philosophy. And we need to provide students with these multiple pathways to pursue different interests and to allow their parents, once again, to engage in charting those pathways. One of the things we felt very strongly about was blurring the lines between our community college system and our K-12 system, and taking those two very prominent education pathways and mixing them. And so today in our high schools, you can take any of our community college classes in dual enrollment. You can pursue a credential and get an industry recognized credential and go work right away, and the state will pay for it. We want you to do this. But on top of that, we also recognize that targeted, focused education environments that can elicit the passion from a student to pursue a dream, that's pretty special. And so we thought long and hard, how can we do this when we have these constraints on charter schools? And we came up with the idea of lab schools. Lab schools are effectively unique schools done in collaboration with an institution of higher education that, beyond that, can focus on almost anything. And so we launched a lab school initiative, and just this past week, I think we clipped through 15, Madam Secretary, of lab schools opened across the Commonwealth of Virginia. Lab schools that range from teaching lab schools in some of our rural counties, where if you want to go to the lab school, you can receive your associate's degree by the time you're finished. You can then jump into one of our universities and finish in 2 years, and you can be back teaching. Healthcare lab schools, where we address the healthcare workforce shortage in Southwest Virginia, and you can be anything from a radiology tech to head on and be a brain surgeon if you want, but come through our lab school. Exciting one for me. I've always wanted to be an astronaut. I'm too big to go up in space. But we opened up a space lab school this past week on the Eastern Shore, right by Wallops Island. And it's done in partnership, of course, with industry at Wallops Island. And we opened up a maritime lab school right in the heart of our shipbuilding industry. Again, in partnership with industry and our colleges, that provides pathways. And if you want to get a credential and you want to go help build the next Virginia-class submarine, we're there for you. And if you want to head on to Virginia Tech and design the next Virginia-class submarine, we got it for you. We have lab schools that are focused on younger ages and ones that are focused on middle school. And of course, the tech lab schools for coding are everywhere. What we're seeing, of course, is a massive, massive receptivity to wanting to be in these environments, because we go back to parents. Parents can see a passion in their child that's different in this environment versus that environment. They want to work with their children and open that up. And that's why these kinds of alternative pathways are so important. Because again, one size doesn't fit all. And in fact, if we think it does, we're going to fail as an education system.
So you just told a pretty happy story about partnership with Virginia Higher Ed. Virginia obviously has a famed system of public higher education, but one that you've argued over the last 4 years has had a lot of challenges, and you've made a series of efforts, board appointments and other steps to try to address it. Can you talk a little bit about the state of Virginia public higher ed, what you've seen that's been of concern, and how you've tried to address that?
Yeah, of course. Higher ed is one of these institutional enigmas. One, it plays such a critical role in everything that we do, preparing students for life, providing a foundation to a talent workforce that will drive our economy, research. It's just critically important, and Virginia has been blessed for a long time. I was at an event last night with Thomas Jefferson, and nobody even said a thing when I said that. So I was at an event with Thomas Jefferson last night, and he was commenting on the fact that he attended the best university in Virginia, the College of William and Mary, because UVA hadn't started yet. Come on, stay with me here, folks. But what we, of course, saw when we came in our higher ed universe was a series of real challenges. One was just cost, escalating costs. And can't we just keep tuition flat or mostly flat? Two, we saw a real challenge in matching degree pathways to the needs of the marketplace. And in fact, we were educating a lot of students with degrees that didn't lead to something that I think they all aspire to, which is a job.
At least their parents aspire.
As
to.
parents do. Third is the expectations of the time that it would take. How do we hold people accountable? Universities are measuring graduation rates in 6 years, not 4. And finally, the standards of campus behavior, whether that is really crushing self-expression all the way through to almost enabling violence on campus towards other students, had to be addressed. Those were big issues that really concerned us. And so we went to work. I did something that no governor has done before, which is I meet with all of our public university presidents every quarter. And they were a little shocked. Well, of course I'm meeting with you every quarter because, one, you have a huge amount of my budget, and two, I want to make sure you understand what my expectations are. What's really interesting is when you ask all the presidents to come and they say, well, can I send a proxy? And you say no, and by the way, we'll be talking about your budget. They all show up. How about that? It works. It works. But we started to tackle these issues. And I will say one of the ones that, and we'll talk a little bit about transparency a little bit more, but when it comes to higher ed outcomes, the first thing we had to do was rethink what publicly available data parents and students can actually see. And today you can go to the Council of Higher Education website in Virginia and you can see college outcomes. And the feeds into this are what does it cost to get different degrees and what are students realizing as far as jobs and salaries as a result of those degrees. And being a historical finance guy, you can do your own net present value of it. Is it worth paying for that degree in order to get this outcome? That was a huge step because what it allowed us to do was basically bring in a whole data set on attractive, fast-growing careers, which is also part of our overall workforce training efforts and part of our company recruiting efforts, and blend that into what we were doing in higher ed. The second thing that we felt like we had to do was change the culture of free speech on campus. And we started hosting literally free speech symposiums. The first one we had was at Mr. Jefferson's University at Virginia. And we asked, invited, I think is the right word, but everyone came when you invite them. We invited presidents from every public university and private university, and provosts and deans, and everyone came, and we talked about what it meant to have free speech on campus. And what was remarkable is we required everyone to write a free speech plan that then came to the secretary, and we worked through implementation of those plans, and it's still in progress. We spend an enormous amount of time on campus safety. And I have to say the anti-Semitic actions that were demonstrated at universities not in Virginia compelled us to make sure that they weren't going to happen in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so we went and got our public safety effort. And so the gentleman that ran our Public Safety and Homeland Security Secretariat became the point on integrating both detection and response to violence on campus. And what we found, of course, is that campus police had not really been engaged in campus administration. They were kind of shoved off to the side. And so we asked every board of visitors to have the campus police chief present to the board once a year on campus safety. All of this translates into a recognition that we have a long way to go in higher ed, and we recognize that. I think the big step that we've taken over the course of the last 6 months has been really dismantling the DEI infrastructure that was placed in every one of the universities. And think about what that touches. First, it touches cost. Just an enormous cost that candidly was driving up tuition and other fees. And if you ask universities to highlight the growth in expenses from in-classroom to overhead, it's stunning how much overhead has been added over the last 5 to 10 years. The second issue, of course, was freedom of speech on campus, and the real belief from students that they were not allowed to really express themselves. And we saw it in survey after survey after survey that they felt intimidated in the classroom to not just disagree with their classmates, but even more so with the professor, because they were going to be penalized as such. It translated into a real necessity to make sure that we overhauled admissions requirements, and that's happening now. And then finally, it translates into students feeling like they have a real opportunity for success. What it doesn't mean is that you dismantle the support system that exists if a student needs help. And it goes back to something I said about K through 12. We can provide support for students who are in an academic setting who need help, and we should. But it doesn't mean that we, in fact, are going to vacate the ideas of meritocracy and success, and by the way, a real academic exchange where we can exchange views that may, in fact, disagree with one another. How about that for an idea, as opposed to, again, one size fits all for every student?
Beautifully said. You know, one of the things you just touched on, obviously, the DEI question. One of your first actions, might be your first executive order, I can't recall, was your Divisive Concepts executive order.
It was my first.
Which at the time I think was the first in the land, trying to distinguish between engaging with American history, with American civics, good and bad, versus proselytizing, versus politicizing the classroom. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit about how you try to make that distinction as we think about dismantling DEI.
Yeah.
I'd also be interested, what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong as conservatives right now in our effort to dismantle DEI?
Yeah. Well, let me go first at the philosophy around what we should be teaching and shouldn't be teaching. What we should be teaching, and I'll just take history, is all of it, the good and the bad. I think one of the greatest characteristics of this nation is that we are a nation that oftentimes got the philosophy right and the implementation wrong. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Let's just stop there. Our founders who wrote that at the time, many of them were slave owners. Philosophy, they wanted to write down because they knew it was right. It's just taken us a long time to get it right. And so we should not hide chapters of our history, even though they are incredibly difficult. But we can't blame the current generation for those sins of the past. And so we've got to do this in a way that educates but doesn't blame. That's hard. And I think that's one place where the divisive concepts in teaching went way wrong, which is it took difficult chapters and translated them into blame. And can you imagine as a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or even a 17 or 18-year-old being told that you personally were responsible or partaking in the kinds of actions that, of course, were abhorrent? That just isn't right. And so that was our first standard. Our second standard was to make sure that parents understand what's going on in the classroom. Because we also know that classroom discussions may cut across family values. And I think family values come first. Faith values, standards and norms come first for a family. That is a parent's decision with regards to their child. And therefore, we have to make sure that parents know what's going on. And we were successful in passing legislation, which candidly shocked me. A couple Democrats came my way that said if there are sexually explicit materials being used in the classroom, you as a parent first have to know they're there, and second of all, you can request substitute materials. This was hugely controversial at the time. And in fact, this was the bill that my opponent in 2021 had vetoed back when he was governor, that caused him to reiterate his true belief that parents should not have a say in what's being taught in our schools. And then finally, there are interactions that go on between students and teachers and counselors and administrators. And those interactions oftentimes begin to touch on issues that parents must be the primary advisor and decision maker with their child. And parents were being shut out. And I hate to say it, but this at least allegation that in Fairfax County that there were counselors that were arranging abortions for children in 2021 without telling their parents is the example that almost shocks it shocks the conscience. And so all of that was what we were trying to get at. When we undertook the big effort of overhauling our history standards, and everybody knows I like to grab the hardest thing and do it first, it was hard. We had huge involvement from lots of people. There had been standards that had been written by a previous group that candidly were really not right for Virginia. They needed to be updated. They needed to be adjusted. And did we get it right in the first pass? No, we didn't. But by the time we were done, I think Virginia today has the very best history and civic standards in America. And that was the goal. And I look forward to our students being educated in that framework, because I think once again, Virginia will produce the best educated historians, civic-minded citizens in America, and that was our goal.
And I want to open it up, take some questions. But first, is the national pushback on DEI has evolved, including a number of extraordinary successes. Anything we're getting wrong?
We just first begin with the basic premise that we've got to prohibit illegal discrimination. That's where we start. And I think that is the right objective. And of course, I think what we're seeing is that opening doors for Virginians and Americans from all walks of life is really important. One of the things that we wanted to do in Virginia, and I think this could be something that would provide support mechanisms, is to recognize that some student groups aren't as prepared as others. And so one of the things we did when we changed the admissions policy by legislation to our governor's school to put it back to merit was also to recognize in 7th and 8th grade there may be some schools across the Commonwealth of Virginia that were underperforming schools. Now we had to redo our accreditation system in order to see that might need extra support. And so I do think that there's a marrying here of there's nothing wrong with raising the floor. And how we raise the floor, particularly in K through 12 education, I think must be a corollary to making sure that we have a fully merit-based higher ed system. And so we've got work to do in K through 12. I have a very clear philosophy, which is I believe that choice is critical for parents to navigate the best possibilities for their children and to match those possibilities to their child's passions. We also recognize that in a full choice system, we are going to have, you pick the number, 80 to 85% of our students that are still in the public school system. And so we've got to fix the public school system. We have got to do the things necessary in order to fix it. We have got to find a way to minimize the union's impacts in our schools. And they just sometimes seem to not be worried about the children. They seem to be worried about lots of other things. And we've got to recognize that if we have a a non-market system that is run by states and localities, that it's not going to react to students leaving, we better get on it and figure out how to improve it and to raise expectations and to have accountability and to provide multiple pathways within the public school system. So the public school system is going to have to compete. That's a good thing, but it's going to need a lot of help from all of you and folks all across America to help it compete well.
All right, we have time for a few questions. I'm going to ask that folks catch either Anna or Greg's eye. I'm going to ask that folks be kind enough to identify themselves by name and affiliation, and I'm going to ask that you ask a question. If I don't see a question in the first 10 to 15 seconds,
Then you run for Congress.
we're going to give somebody else a chance. Anna?
Governor, my name is Marty Danefelsrum with the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. Congress just passed a big bill, and they included a tax credit in that for parents who donate to scholarship granting organizations. But unfortunately, due to a determination by the Senate parliamentarian, they included an opt-in provision in which the governor of that state has to decide that the parents in that state can get a tax credit for donating to a scholarship granting organization in their state.
Yes.
So the next governor is going to make that decision, I believe. And could you perhaps challenge the candidates who are running for governor in Virginia to say where they stand on that, whether they stand with the taxpayers or whether the governor can veto the taxpayers' ability to have that tax credit?
Thanks,
Perfect.
Governor.
Thank you. First of all, this was a landmark moment where a tax incentivized choice program that works incredibly well in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we have a very successful one, translated into a national policy moment. So there's two suppositions in your question that I want to fix. The first one is that we have to wait until the guidance comes out before a governor commits to it. And second of all, that I will allow the next governor to make that decision. So I know I was, as you were asking that question, I was watching our superintendent and our secretary lean forward. We're going to be first. We're going to be first in opting in. This is a hugely important step for us to demonstrate that this construct, which provides to families that otherwise would not have an opportunity to make the choice for their child to attend an alternative education pathway, all of a sudden has it. We're going to be first. And therefore, I invite help from everybody here in helping us preempt whatever the guidance is, because I will not leave office without making sure that Virginia has already agreed to do whatever is necessary for us to fully participate.
Beautiful. We just made news. I
There we
love
go.
it. Greg.
Thank you. Kyle Beltramini with the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. In the introduction, there was a note about the great work that you did building a bipartisan consensus on matters of education, particularly higher education. Unfortunately, it looks like that consensus is broken down recently with the General Assembly doing everything in their power to stop any and all appointments to Virginia's governing boards. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about this issue that's popped up and what's changed recently that's caused so much consternation between you and the General Assembly.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I will be somewhat careful because our Supreme Court is hopefully going to rule very shortly on this particular issue, which has a lot to do with a committee of the General Assembly's Senate body's ability to speak for the whole General Assembly. I think this one's really clear that a committee cannot speak for the whole General Assembly, and therefore I'm looking forward to the Supreme Court's ruling, and therefore I think this will get resolved pretty quickly. With that said, I think that the far extreme left leadership of our Senate and our House in Virginia has taken advantage of their leadership positions and is trying to project a prevention of all the things we've just talked about, of complying with federal law and making sure that there isn't illegal discrimination on campus, of trying to keep tuition low, of trying to make sure that we have transparency on how universities and our colleges are performing, on trying to match outcomes to costs and giving families the ability to hold these schools accountable for delivering. And I think this is at the heart of it, because we now have boards of visitors at all our universities that I have appointed. And for those of you that don't know this, you get a quarter every year of each one of the boards. And so somewhere in your third year, you cross over from being in a minority or just there into a majority. And it's not until your fourth year that you actually have a supermajority of these boards. This is the moment where they're trying to stop all of that. And I've been very clear. I think what they are doing is not only counter to our Constitution, the Supreme Court will decide that, but I think it's incredibly damaging to the governance of our great institutions. And then I just want to couple it with one last moment, which is the people who serve on these boards are volunteers. They're extraordinary examples of servant leaders in our communities who have, in their own respect, have accomplished extraordinary things, and they're willing to give back their time and talent to our universities. And now we have a group of left liberal progressives who are saying that they are not, their service is not consistent with the values of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Are you kidding me? That's what's at stake here. And that's why I firmly believe that not only is the constitutional moment correct, governors appoint boards of visitors during a regular session, or if they have a special session, if the entire General Assembly opines on whether those particular appointees will be confirmed or not, that's the constitutional process. But to try to sneak in jiggery-pokery and upset what has been an incredibly consistent and reliable governance practice at our universities, I think is just so fundamentally wrong.
I think we have time for one more question. Hannah?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Governor. Liam Knox, I'm an education reporter with Bloomberg News. There's been in the past couple of months a lot of federal involvement and attention on some of your public universities, the University of Virginia, recently George Mason University, investigations from multiple federal agencies at both universities, some pressure for presidents to step down. Jim Ryan did in fact resign. I'm wondering if you've been an active participant in any of these efforts, how you feel about whether you're in agreement with some of the charges being levied by the federal government, and how you feel about federal intervention in some of your state, your most prominent state institutions of higher education.
Yeah. Lots of questions there, so I'm just going to grab a couple and do my best if I can. Let me just first begin with the specific circumstances around the University of Virginia. President Jim Ryan was going to step down anyway. And in fact, in his resignation, he in fact said, I was planning on resigning at the end of the summer. And so the step for him to step down had already been taken in his own mind, and he acknowledged it. And I think that was just something that concurrently happened with pressure from the federal government. And so regardless of the timing of June versus August, I'm quite confident that Jim Ryan, based on his own words, was going to resign as president of the University of Virginia. I do believe that the federal government is holding institutions of higher education accountable to comply with the law. All of our universities now have passed resolutions that say they're going to comply with the law, and that the DEI infrastructure that had existed on their university campuses, not all of them actually had it, will of course be deconstructed. And they've committed, based on board resolutions at every one of the institutions, to do exactly that. And so again, the pressure from the federal government to do what they had already agreed to do is not inconsistent with a very simple view that I have, which is if you promise to do something, you should do it. And I think the pressure from the federal government in the case of University of Virginia, particularly, helped accelerate something that wasn't happening at the pace that I wanted it to. And in fact, I had written to the board and asked them to accelerate the process that had been agreed to under their resolution. In a big picture, I have very much appreciated the collaboration that I've had with the Trump administration on lots of fronts. I believe that we have an administration that is willing to work with us as a state. I have to say, in the previous 3 years as governor during the Biden administration, the most frequent interaction I had with the Biden administration was being sued. I like this a lot better. And I find that when we have conversations, as opposed to filing suit against one another, we can accomplish extraordinary things. And we've done exactly that. We've had tremendous collaboration across our entire cabinet level, everything from public safety to working on K through 12 education, and to work together on how we make sure that Virginia's complying with federal law at the higher ed level, to what we're doing in public health and behavioral health, what we're doing in transportation, what we're doing in space. Just yesterday, I was at a groundbreaking ceremony for a new company that is going to build the very first tin production and processing facility in America. And it's anchored by a DoD need, and it's going to be in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so I find the collaboration broadly across the federal government to be not just refreshing, but extraordinary, and I deeply appreciate it.
Governor, we promised we'd get your people, you promised your people we'd get you out here too. Do want to give you one last word. Education 2025, we've got an enormous number of challenges. If you were to give us one charge, drawing on your experience and looking forward, what is it?
So I could go big picture, but I want to go very narrow with something that I think will influence the health, the safety, and the academic success of our children more than anything else. Bell-to-bell, cell phone free education. Get them out of the schools.
Governor, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, folks.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you.
Let the governor out.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
Really fun.